Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, dear Canadians, anglophones et francophones. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity as part of the lecture series showcasing Austrian scholars to focus on the field of literature, which I not only think but know is a never-ending source of reflection on human beings, on their fears and ambitions, their longings and fantasies, their entanglements, predicaments, and of course also their fragility. As a literary scholar who teaches French language literatures at the Innsbruck Institute of Romance Studies, I was naturally delighted to hear that about 20% more books were sold in France between the end of the lockdown in May and mid-July than during the same period the previous year. And if the figures given by Vincent Brousseau-Pouliot in La Presse on January 13, 2021 are correct, 5.2% more books were sold in Quebec in 2020 than in 2019, and sales actually increased by 31% between August and December last year. Some say that this is due to the limited recreational opportunities people have in lockdown. Others speak of reading as an escape from reality. I assume that both assessments are somehow correct, although I don't think they do justice to the many reasons why people turn to literature in times of crisis. Sometime last fall, I asked myself why so many friends and even students would have asked me for books dealing with pandemic catastrophes, either in the past or in imagined futures. Why Albert Camus' famous novel La Peste, The Plague, published in 1947, would have experienced such an overwhelming revival far beyond the borders of France. In mid-April 2020, for example, that is to say in the middle of the first lockdown in Austria, Austrian radio station FM4, together with Vienna's Theater Rabenhof, hosted a marathon reading of Camus' The Plague with prominent Austrian personalities such as the actors Karl Markowitsch, Birgit Minichmayr or Klaus Maria Brandauer, the musicians Ernst Molden and Arik Brauer, who recently passed away unluckily, the authors Elfriede Jelinek and Daniel Kehlmann, amongst many others. Even Cardinal Christoph Schönborn and former Austrian Federal President Heinz Fischer lent their voices to Camus' narrative. Since its publication, the novel has been read primarily as an allegory of the Brown Plague during the Nazi occupation of France from 1940 to 1944. But then the text can also be read very literally, as the chronicle of a society in a state of emergency. Everything that people have experienced so far during the corona pandemic is already described in Camus' novel. There is incredulity, uncertainty, denial, hesitation to take action, and finally, the most anxiety-inducing experience of being sealed off. There are the victims and those who immediately try to capitalize on the situation. There are the questions of what is true and what is false, whether political leaders can be trusted or not, and many more. Camus' novel is particularly convincing when it describes the changes in the community under the pressure of the plague and shows how the plague destroys public space. And then the novel addresses a core issue, at least in my eyes. How ought we to behave in such a situation? How does the individual need to behave so that the community built upon solidarity can keep on functioning? This is, of course, a moral question, a question of conscience. Camus' protagonist, the physician Rieux, finds, I quote, qu'il s'agit d'honnêteté. C'est une idée qui peut faire rire, mais la seule façon de lutter contre la peste, c'est l'honnêteté. In English, it's a matter of common decency. That's an idea which may make some people smile, but the only means of fighting a plague is common decency. Unquote. So why would or why should people turn to literature, not only but especially in times of crisis? The idea I would like to put forward here is that fiction, and speculative fiction in particular, can serve as a space for us to think the unthinkable, not only in crisis, but also before crisis and after crisis, and to engage with what is or might be possible in our societies and what we are not actually prepared for. Speculative fiction is a subgenre of science fiction and deals with human rather than technological problems. And it exclusively focuses on possible futures. In her essay collection, Writing with Intent, Margaret Atwood holds that everything in her dystopian speculative fictions, The Handmaid's Tale and Oryx and Crake, is inspired by what is possible in reality. I quote, "As with The Handmaid's Tale, Oryx and Crake invents nothing we haven't already invented or started to invent. Every novel begins with a what if and then sets forth its axioms. The what if of Oryx and Crake is simply, what if we continue down the road we are already on? How slippery is the slope? What are our saving graces? Who's got the will to stop us?" Unquote. In his book, Theory for the World to Come, published in 2019, anthropologist Matthew Wolfe-Mayer argues that speculative fictions, by imagining or considering many different possibilities of the future, can be a treasure trove for addressing key questions we need to ask about our future. What is to be done, he asks, when the future eludes our capacities for imaginative play and scientific modeling? One possibility is to imagine them one by one, to play with catastrophes and apocalypses in the confines of a novel or film or study. Speculative fiction does this with aplomb. Imagine a catastrophe, a natural disaster, a widespread epidemic, and model what happens next across society, from individual lives and families to cities and nations to the globe. Matthew Wolfe-Mayer considers speculative fiction as a kind of social theory. Both traditions, he insists, ask us to imagine worlds that can be described and depicted, and ask us as audiences and also as readers to imagine the rules that undergird a society and its human and more than human relationships. What are the systems of belief of these people, and how do they impact the everyday experience of identity categories like race, ethnicity, disability, gender, sexuality, and class? What are the bases of identity categories? What is the role of human nature? What are the institutions that shape society and people's everyday lives? There is, of course, nothing new in the idea that fiction can be a useful tool for theoretical purposes. What makes Matthew Wolfe Mayer's vision so interesting is the fact that he combines this knowledge with a radical critique of the dominant methods and approaches to problems that should primarily concern us. Alternative histories, he states, are important not just as what-if stories, but also as a means to denaturalize the latent conception that knowledge produced in any discipline is objective, and that there are no alternatives. So taking an institution or a person as it is and putting it into the future is a way to speculate about what might come next. To illustrate what speculative fiction does, especially from a socio-critical perspective, I would like to present to you the novel Oscar de Profundis by the Quebec writer Catherine Mavrikakis, which unfortunately has not yet been translated into English, so all the English quotes are, so to speak, homemade. Catherine Mavrikakis' footprint in the polyphonic field of Quebec literature is significant. In 20 years, she has published 10 novels, an oratorio, and many more. She has composed a true work, I would say, in which death, approached from different angles, is certainly at the forefront of her highly original formal quest. I would like to start my reading of Oscar de Profundis with a look on Zygmunt Bauman's last essay, Retrotopia. Retrotopia was published shortly after his death in January 2017. And in this essay, Zygmunt Bauman explains that Walter Benjamin's enigmatic interpretation of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus of 1920 on the concept of history must be rethought for the 21st century. Today, the Angelus Novus, renamed the Angel of History by Walter Benjamin, in its unbraked flight, no longer turns its face towards a past marked by catastrophe and destruction, while the storm of progress propels it into the future. In our days, Zygmunt Bauman says, I quote, "The angel of history is caught in the midst of a U-turn, his face turning from the past to the future, his wings being pushed backwards by the storm, blowing this time from the imagined, anticipated, and feared in advance hell of the future towards the paradise of the past, as probably it is retrospectively imagined after it has been lost and fallen into ruins." Unquote. This vision perfectly applies to the dystopian tomorrow imagined by Catherine Mavrikakis' novel Oscar de Profundis. In a late 21st century Montreal afflicted by climate change, epidemics, and the scarcity of resources, society is alienated by surveillance and all-embracing digital manipulation. The two protagonists, Oscar Ashland and Kate Berube, find aesthetic consolation and political motivation in the cultures of the past. The personal yesterdays, however, are anything but paradise. Both figures look back on a complex past marked by traumatic experiences. The singer and global superstar Oscar Ashland, alias Oscar de Profundis, was born into a Montreal upper-class family. His younger brother was kidnapped and murdered as a child. Kate Berube, on the other hand, lives amongst the beggars of central Montreal. By some, she is regarded as a former medical doctor who fell out of the system due to a medical malpractice. Others think of her as a fugitive convict hiding in the city center's street canyons and underground tunnel system. There are two things these otherwise very different characters have in common. They both speak several languages, some of which are already extinct or in the process of extinction. French is their mother tongue, by the way. And they both possess exceptional historical and fine arts knowledge, which is unusual for their time and links them to long-forgotten models of life. Language skills are not readily appreciated in the new democracy of the global state in Oscar de Profundis. On the contrary, the quasi-dictatorship acting under the guise of democracy has been systematically trying to eradicate them for decades. So, Kate seems to be driven by a militant humanism which she owes to the reading of leftist theories, to the Paris Commune, the anarchists of the Troisième République, and especially to Louise Michel. In her eyes, they still determined political action at the beginning of the 21st century. The passionate collector Oscar Ashland, for his part, identifies with another facet of the fin de siècle, the late 19th century. That is, its aestheticism, or more precisely, aestheticism's most prominent literary incarnation, Des Esseintes, the decadent hero of Huysmans' novel À rebours, Against the Grain. Oscar had Baudelaire's sonnet De Profundis Clamavi tattooed on his back and spends his nights listening to Wagner's Parsifal, drifting, oblivious of the world in artificial paradises, including those of the late 20th and early 21st century, which inspired inspire his stage spectacles. Through her protagonists, Catherine Mavroukakis configurates two retrotopian scenarios, or phantasms, which sometimes appear like memories from the future, memories of a reality that seems very immediate to the reader. Only Oscar's retrotopia finally endures. But, as is implied in the novel, even his collections might not last eventually. The past, in whatever form, has been declared useless, even obstructive to the progress of the world state's new democracy. Catherine Mavroukakis' novel is laced, one could say, with intertextual references and numerous insights into Montreal's cultural geography and history. Oscar Ashland's and Kate Berube's path cross only once and briefly, but in a most spectacular way. Oscar comes to Montreal on his world tour, but a few days before Oscar's concerts in the so-called Corona Hall, an epidemic breaks out. Despite some disturbing deaths, the concerts are not cancelled under pressure from the city's tourism lobby. To bring the whole thing quickly to the point, while the eccentric Oscar, who has taken up residence with his entire court in the last inhabitable late 19th century mansion in the city centre, cannot leave after his concerts due to the rampant Black Disease, the city centre is sealed off by the military, Kate decides to seize an unexpected opportunity and to kidnap Oscar Ashland. Helped by her closest confidants, as well as Montreal's last bookseller, Adrian Monk. And I'll get back to this later. So the protagonists not only have their education in common, which in the context of the acting time seems, of course, anachronistic. They also share the conviction that they are moving towards the end of the world. Oscar belongs to the winners of the new democracy, in which the liberal right powers have closed all state institutions, except from the secret services, and have done everything possible to turn the citizens into ignorant consumers of the present. Oscar imagines the end as a planetary catastrophe and himself as a detached stoic observer of the end time to come. As such, he not only speaks in his typical decadent attitude of the monotony of catastrophes, but also compares himself to the character of Justine in Lars von Trier's film Melancholia. I quote, "He recognized himself in Justine. He went out and decided to die while he would watch the comet that would hit the planet approaching. In the face of this calamity, one had no choice but to be curious and greet the apocalypse with depth and distance," unquote. Kate's apocalyptic premonition lacks the possibility of this philosophical depth and distance Oscar claims for himself. Her foreboding springs, in fact, from the first-hand experience of being trapped in the virus-infested urban centre of Montreal, where the military and police are struggling to isolate the human waste, as the poor are called, produced by the capitalist system of the global state, to isolate them from the privileged classes and, as it were, to dispose of it. I quote, "The Black Disease presented itself as a natural scourge, but the draggers understood that the world government had obviously found effective and safe ways to get rid of its vermin without raising any indignation. The extermination of the poor would allow the wealthy to appropriate the products of the planet and get rid of any sense of guilt," unquote. It is easy to see that the author uses the topos of the pandemic with the intention to address humanitarian, cultural, and environmental catastrophes that are already smoldering or that are inherent in our present and will become reality or might become reality in the future. In the spatio-temporal freeze frame of the quarantine, and through the example of two hyperbolically drawn antipodal lives, she also imagines and studies human attitudes and behavior in extreme situations. She uses the exceptional situation of the epidemic to show that this exacerbates and sometimes radically reverses the habitus of individuals. Ultimately, she also raises the question of what leeway people have, especially in extreme situations. And what essentially determines their scope? Class, race, and gender, just to name a few, one could state quite succinctly. One thing becomes clear from the very first pages of the novel. The epidemic does not affect everyone in the same way, not equally, so to speak. The virus is neither democratic nor class-blind. Oscar, who is usually driven by excessive desire for action, traveling the globe, saving valuable architecture from decay, collecting books, films, art, music recordings, and even mortal remains of great figures of the past, this Oscar de Profundis takes a wait and see position, one might say. So a wait and see position during the 7 days of quarantine in Montreal. He becomes the passive observer par excellence. The black disease does not affect him directly, and of course he has hired a private physician to take care of him. For him, it is all a matter of sitting out the situation. So while the black disease rages in the city center and all around the mansion guarded by soldiers, and while armored bulldozers can hardly cope with the mountains of corpses, Oscar allows himself some fresh air in the barricaded garden. Enjoying the first snow of the season, he quotes from Lucretius' De Rerum Natura. "'Tis sweet when down the mighty main the winds roll up its waste of waters, from the land to watch another's laboring anguish fall. Not that we joyously delight that man should thus be smitten, but because it's sweet to mark that evils we ourselves be spared. 'Tis sweet, again, to view the mighty strife of armies embattled, yonder over the plains, ourselves no shares in the peril." Unquote. For Kate and the amorphous mass of poor and beggars, things are different, of course. They find themselves in the middle of the epidemic, undernourished, at the mercy of the nearing winter, and without any possibility of protecting themselves against the virus. At first, they search along the walls of the alleys for dry places to sleep, cursing and swearing. And finally, as they sleep, they merge with the desolate cityscape. Soon, the general mood tips over into delusional craziness, and the rumor mills boil over. As more and more of them fall ill and perish miserably in a very short time, many are seized by some sort of frenzy and destructive, even self-destructive actionism, roaming the streets in groups, looting the stores in deserted downtown Montreal, feasting on the hull, drinking, partying. They turn a deaf ear to Kate's call to show solidarity and demand medical care. The daily struggle for sheer survival not only takes up all their time, but has broken their will to make a difference. Nothing now seems more attractive to them than to seize the opportunity and dance to death at the apocalyptical ball in their Cour des Miracles, in their Court of Wonders. Facing her own death, Kate wants at least set an example by kidnapping the global superstar Oscar. She deeply regrets that she did not organize the uprising more systematically, and that she did not earlier put into action the knowledge gained from her readings of ancient political texts. The kidnapping succeeds, but Oscar is freed by the army of the global state just as quickly as he was kidnapped. Kate and her friends die in a hail of machine gun bullets, and only the bookseller, Adrian Monk, survives and later becomes librarian in Oscar's private library. After all, Oscar, who suffers from insomnia, owes it to Adrian to have slept through the liberation, thanks to a very efficient narcotic Adrian gave to him. In the 12 chapters of her novel, Catherine Mavrikakis unfolds not only two opposing characters, but also, as I hope to have made clear, opposing social realities that are unambiguously imprinted in the urban space. From the very beginning of the novel, the fact that Oscar and not Kate would survive is part of the apocalyptic logic of the world the readers are confronted with in the book and in their own reality. Thus, as a kind of memory from the future, the novel not only casts its shadow on our time, but also raises questions for us. Questions such as what the COVID-19 pandemic will make visible in what form of decadence we want to live in, and in what form and by whom our archives will be shaped and managed. The question of whether our archives should really be entrusted to the Oscar de profundis of this world is a question that deserves to be explored with particular care. At the end of Theory for the World to Come, Matthew Wolfe Mayer notes that social theory and speculative fiction are, I quote, not just a game of what if, but a challenge to complacency and resignation, unquote. This is certainly also true for Katrin Mavrick-Kakir's novel, which will hopefully soon be translated into English so that all of you, even those who do not speak French, will be able to take a look at it, to read it. Thank you.